Has traveling helped you deepen your perspective of the unity of religions? And if so, how?
Well, traveling and encountering other religions is something that I would say is affirming, but only with the background of the perennialist understanding that I brought to those experiences.
That's right. Same here. Very nice to come in contact.
So I remember what I was saying, which is that traveling has been very helpful, but only in light of the understanding that I have from perennialism about what it is that I'm finding when I travel, and that has been very affirming.
Right. It's easier to, not just in the abstract, appreciate other religions when you come culturally in contact with them. And it just makes it more real. So it deepens our feeling about religions. I don't know if it's deepened any perspectives.
Well, one thing I'd like to have you comment on, is that there's something about going to foreign sites where they're practicing foreign religion and finding a lot of people who are thoroughly committed to these various forms, but who don't have a perennialist understanding of it.
I mean, that's to be expected.
Yes, it's to be expected, but then one is in the position of saying, so what is it they see and what is it they're getting here?
That's a good question.
And you have to try to answer that from their perspective.
Yeah, I couldn't answer it from their perspective. However, I do remember the first time I was on Bali that I developed some kind of connection with Ganesha.
Well, really? Can you tell us more about that?
No, I really can't much. Just that when I went to, Pui, what's the Mother Temple? Anyway.
We always call it the Mother Temple.
Yeah, well, that's in our language. No, I don't know. Just for some reason, I kept noticing him and felt some kind of affinity and, went over and touched the idol and talked to him, and not much, but,
Well, you're talking about you engaged this other form.
Yes, exactly. And I can't say on what level. It's just that I felt like I had a friend, and I couldn't explain it and still can't.
Do you think that perennialism helps that in the sense that Ganesha is more of a friend to you because you get it? Because you get the instantiation of wisdom?
It's hard to say, but it probably the perspective I had before I went left me more open to such a thing.
Yes, all right. Yes, certainly. I'd go further than that and say that it made it possible.
Well, I don't know. That could well be.
That's how it would seem to me. Anyway, are we wandering?
If I may, can I ask, you said about seeing him as a friend. What was it that you were looking for in a friendship that made you connect to the idol in such a way?
Well, it is possible that I had some sense of being alone and disconnected, but I don't remember feeling that in particularly, because it really felt like a great adventure, and I did actually meet other people. So I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Some of it's in the atmosphere, but I cannot explain it. I simply have no explanation.
May not be explainable.
Yeah, and I still feel like I have some kind of connection, although on the spiritual level I don't engage it. But when I think about it, I have feelings for it. I don't know why.
You have the sense that next time you see Ganesha, you might get a wink?
That would be nice.
And were there any other places that you explored that sort of had a huge impact as far as realizing the unity of religions is concerned?
With a perennialist background, one immediately tries to answer that question in terms of the symbols one sees, or the art and architecture that calls to mind the Platonic forms or something like that. But I'm not sure, well, at least it isn't that way for me. And when I think of the, let's call them religious experiences I've had when I've been traveling, they weren't that symbolic. They had more to do with the beauty of the place and the moment.
Right. When you went to the Sundance.
The Sundance, yes, there's an example.
I think we might have mentioned that last time we talked, or you might have.
I don't recall that, so let's hear it again.
The sunrise, I mean, it's possibly the most beautiful moment of my life. Standing on the plain in Wyoming with the sun coming up, blowing our eagle-billed whistles, with Chief Yellowtail watching the sun being born that day. Just overwhelming. And you know, it was a sunrise. It happens every day.
Yes, but the world is reborn every day.
Yes,
you find that expressed in indigenous religion. I know it's an American Indian phenomenon. Belief, I don't know if it's universal, but that's where I heard it first.
Well, sunrise is pretty universal.
Well, yeah, by its nature it's special.
Yes. But anyway, that's one moment of being in a place and a religious setting and having everything just be overwhelmingly clear. I've also mentioned being at the temple at Delphi, where it had pretty much, not at that magnitude, but it certainly had the same flavor as one has in Mecca. There's some language somewhere about there are places in the world where boundary or the layer between this world and the next world is thinner. That might be a way to look at those places.
And I think also, I just realized that sometimes I talk about how moved I was by some of the geology in Utah, the formations and colors.
Yes, you've spoken about that several times.
Yes, and you know, I think there is a unity of religions aspect to it. I had forgotten that I was keenly aware, before I even saw them, that I had to drive through a lot of Indian territory. So I saw Native Americans at places and saw homes and people doing things. And so when I beheld some of these formations, I suppose it did connect me with American Indian religion. I mean, it was part of my experience just from having driven there. It's the only time I've had that kind of reaction to natural setting. I mean, much more so than Grand Canyon, for instance.
More so than the Grand Canyon?
Yes.
That has been mentioned to me several times. First seeing the Grand Canyon is startling.
It is startling. But I felt like my Utah experience penetrated more deeply into me.
Well, so be it.
Happened to be driving past Moab, stop and look around.
Well, on your recommendation, I'd certainly like to do that.
Well, I recommend it, yes.
That's Canyons National Park around there?
There's Canyonlands and Arches are both there. And depending on what direction you arrive from, you might drive a little bit into the Valley of the Gods.
The Valley of the Gods?
Yes.
Is that an actual name of a place?
It's an actual name of the place, and it is on Indian land. And I found it. I did a little side trip there on the way to Moab. And so I actually saw that before I saw some of the other stuff. I think that's the place that it first hit me. And I had another experience beholding those formations and being profoundly moved. But I think it first hit me in the Valley of the Gods, which is not necessarily as spectacular in some ways as the national parks. In some ways.
I think
but it's got some big rocks.
I think we need to go.
All right, well, I could be talked into it.
I was going to ask the next question, which is, because it somewhat seems related to this one, because there's an element of realization in it, but I'll phrase the question as it stands so that maybe there'll be something new that will come out of it. So what is the most profound moment of realization you've had while on a journey?
Well, for me, it would be Utah.
And what was the realization? Can you explain that?
It was experience of timelessness, a connection with ages and ages and ages ago. We're talking geologically. And I just found myself referring to these one particular formation as, I just said to myself, oh, ancient of days. And I had to touch that formation. Kind of hard to hug one of those. They're sort of bulky. But yeah, I would say more so than Mecca, for me.
Yeah, the problem with Mecca was it was just so busy.
Yes.
If you could have the job out of yourself, that would be different. But yes, I understand exactly what you mean.
Right. It was more of a doing than a being.
Yes. And there's so many things to do, and there are a lot of people, and it's very busy.
Yeah, exactly.
And what about you? Was there a particular realization when you were on a journey?
I don't know that I can think of a particular moment of realization, but I recognize that it's at times like at the sunrise in Wyoming or the temple at Delphi or the Black Hills for that matter, this clear sense of it's all here. It's all here and it's perfect. And it's a good thing to go there wherever there happens to be for you and to sort of get in touch with that. But on the other hand, that's not necessary because it really is all here.
Well, that's true. That's quite true. That doesn't mean, though.
You know, pilgrimage is an honorable tradition.
Exactly. And there's no reason not to return to a place that has inspired you.
Yes, exactly. To reacquaint oneself or be in touch with the course of life has made you lose touch with.
Yeah, or just to reinforce. And, you know, I wouldn't...
Reminder, yes.
Yeah. The word realization in this question, I'm not sure what's meant by realization. I think of it in terms of more of a revelation of something.
Can you say more about that?
Well, it's just, maybe realization's all right, going back to its roots. You see...
Making real?
Yeah, the making real, but you see something that you perceive as real, but it's like somebody hit a big gong close to you. And it's not, I didn't come away with any particular thing other than the remembrance of awe. I couldn't say what I realized there except a glimpse of eternity, of timelessness.
Yes.
But I can't say I had a realization, that there was a moment of realization. It was a spiritual experience, and maybe that's good enough.
Well, I suspect if you're open to these things, or if you want to be open to these things, they may be more available than you would think if you're not, or if you don't give them any attention.
Sure. Well, you know, there are times when you can be in the same place and hardly notice, and you might even drive past it every day or something. And one day you may be open and look at it and really be impressed.
Reminds me of a poem called The Bright Field. Should I fetch it for you now?
Yes, please.
Sure, go ahead.
This is R.S. Thomas, who I know nothing about. I grabbed this poem a long time ago, and I'll read it to you. I have seen the sun break through to illuminate a small field for a while, and gone my way and forgotten it. But that was the pearl of great price, the one field that had treasure in it. I realize now that I must give all that I have to possess it. Life is not hurrying to a receding future, nor hankering after an imagined past. It is the turning aside, like Moses, to the miracle of the lit bush, to a brightness that seemed as transitory as youth once, but is eternity that he waits to.
That's pretty good.
Very deep.
I can see why you saved it. I wonder who that guy was. Might be time to look him up.
I think that's probably a good idea. So, were we on a productive track somewhere?
How can the world be perfect as is for those experiencing war and genocide? Does God want them to suffer?
You know, I can't answer those questions.
No. What God wants, or what is God's will, it's a very helpful way of expressing certain things, to talk in terms of that. But you can't deny that the universe cannot unfold contrary to God's will. So God obviously wants the universe, or even something bigger, to unfold as it does. And I don't know that in the process, beings are going to have experiences by interacting with something that's bigger than themselves and may be negative. Why does somebody just walking down the street drop dead of a heart attack at that time?
Yes, there are a lot of these kinds of questions that I think are imponderable, and it doesn't help to put them in anthropomorphic language.
Well, I think that's true. I think the answer to suffering lies beyond the personal God.
Yes, it's a metaphysical property, as it were. That's how Schumann describes it. The necessary component of the unfolding of creation, consequent distance between phenomena and the principle that caused it.
Well, and consider that there are people who have terrible suffering because an earthquake has occurred or a famine, and you don't attribute maleficent motivation or even cause, intention to it, because it happens to be that this is an event that is on such a scale to dwarf physical expressions that we are, and we're not invulnerable.
Yes, and they may not be good, even though it's not intended to be maleficent.
Yeah, it's not personal. It's completely impersonal.
Right. And yet, terrible things do happen.
Yes, exactly. But one of the things I remember in Search of the Miraculous, Ouspensky said Gurdjieff had referred to, and they lived, this book took place during war times and things like that. And they would go places, even though there was turmoil. They also would go places to get away from it. But it was referred to as these things are like cosmic events that happen when the equilibrium needs to be balanced in some fashion. Things are out of sort. Or they could even be astrologically influenced because they're bigger than any person. And even in the case of wars, they generally happen rather than somebody actually saying, all right, well, now is the time to start a genocide. Even the Jewish Holocaust, I think, basically just happened because I don't think it was intended from the beginning. After the Third Reich got rolling, it started to happen, but I don't think anybody thought that at the beginning. They certainly knew that they were going to make Jews the enemy, but I don't think anybody had that planned out. There's some indications from historians.
Yes, and these things take on a life of their own.
Yeah, there's some indication that they just really intended to remove them all, but that became impractical as the war developed. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I can imagine that being the case.
That's what was being said at the time, I know.
And I think in the text, there's also I believe someone might have asked a question in response to which you answered that a person's suffering is in a way a reflection of what's going inside of them.
Yes, I think that's awesome.
In other words, the physical suffering is analogous to the voluntary suffering of dying to yourself?
Right.
That's nicely said.
That's something that I recall reading. And I think some way or another it answers the question of, does God want some to suffer?
Right. Well, there is change in impermanence and becoming, and in that situation, something give way to what is becoming. That might be my body.
Well, this leads me on to the next one, which also somewhat related to this one, which is asking, for those who have lived under oppression, war, and genocide, is it truly a bad thing to be cynical?
Yes. It's always bad.
I love that response.
Yes. A good thing.
We both agreed immediately.
Yeah, it's a good thing. Situations like that give you ample reason to become disillusioned with mankind or with...
And also give you reason to be careful about certain values and certain movements and certain phenomena. But it doesn't call for cynicism.
No, but it calls for realism in a sense, but that's the same thing as disillusionment. When the illusion's gone, what's left? So, and the spiritual... I don't know... Well, there probably are some people, but most people find their way to a spiritual path after a period of disillusionment. You realize that the world is not quite as shiny and sparkly as you thought.
Yes, because I think in Paradise Lost is first the descent, and the first part of the path is, of course, finding it from nothing, or from one's disillusionment, or because one is seeking something because one doesn't have something, or one knows there's more.
Right.
But spiritually speaking, it's much better to be hopeful, trusting, positive, and optimistic, and to be disappointed than it is to be cynical and right. Because cynicism is so corrosive and has such a momentum of its own that it drags you away from the good.
That's right. That's right. If you're cynical, you Well, it's a little bit like the situation now with all the fake news. It's like when the truth comes along, people don't know if they should believe it or not.
Yes, that's right.
And if you're cynical about everything, you may not give really moments of grace a chance to touch you.
Well said.
I think we answered.
To a certain extent, I'm trying to look at this question from another lens, which is, it's asking for those who have lived under oppression, under war, and under genocide. Is it to a certain extent the norm for such people to be cynical, or are we saying that, being cynical is a bad thing, we've established that, but I'm sure the consequences of the experience that they go through, does that shape them to become cynical?
Of course. Probably most people would have that reaction, but clearly a lot of people don't. Some of the people in the concentration camps and things.
Yes, we hear stories of things. Certainly understandable that the people who have suffered a lot and been disappointed a lot are disappointed and don't expect the best in the unfolding of things. But there are those there are those who don't but are surprised.
Even though they went through the suffering, they didn't conclude what they were going through was the nature of things. They clearly saw it for what it was. It's a local phenomenon. And, some people are just simply psychologically destroyed by something like that. And you can't blame them. That's a lot to ask of anybody. And some people won't be able to bear it. And if somebody comes out of that as a cynic, I certainly wouldn't condemn him for being a cynic. It's perfectly understandable as a side effect of having had that horrific experience.
Yes, of course.
And it might be possible to spiritually treat the symptom of that psychological wound, but there's no fault in someone finding themselves a cynic after something like that. But it is unfortunate because cynicism is a bad thing.
Yes.
But so is a giant scar on your leg. So is the loss of a limb from a shrapnel. Those are not...
Yes, and even the fundamental spiritual perspective, which is that finally the good wins. Finally everything makes sense. Finally it's all one. That bad things don't happen, that people aren't in pain, or that terrible things don't occur.
Because they certainly do.
Because they do. Nevertheless, finally, all is one. This does win.
But, some people catch the plague and survive it, and some don't. And it's impossible to know why. And some people, as I say, will just kind of be psychologically wounded so much that you can't blame them for concluding, having had all of their hopes dashed, that the world is just like that, if they didn't already have a strong spiritual principle to frame it. So it's an unfortunate thing, and it happens all too often, but it's understandable. That's all I can say about that.
I think you're pretty good with that question.
You did. So the last one is, the Tariqa is apolitical, but all life is political. Even the choice to not get involved. How do you use politics in your life?
I think that use of the word political is more of an academic use of the term rather than...
That sounds like modernist philosophy to me.
Yeah, or postmodernist, or whatever.
Okay.
But there is, if politics is the way things get worked out among people who don't always agree, then yes, life is political, at least social life is. And the choice of solitude over social life is, I suppose, a political decision, like being apolitical, deciding not to bother with politics. But I don't feel like I use politics in my life other than human interactions and things like that, and disagreements and compromises or not are part of everybody's life. And
right.
I don't think the way I approach life as being political. I think of it as being interpersonal. Although I pay a lot of attention to what is normally called politics, and it turns out I'm much happier being on this call than watching the Democratic primary debates. But I follow the political situation closely, And it can be a spiritual exercise to not be so attached that it yanks you around, because this is a pretty wild ride politically, and I wouldn't want to be yanked. That would just, it'd be pretty rough. People are really suffering because of their attachment to the politics, and it hasn't been that long ago that was me. And it's not like I don't react to it, but some of it you can't help but react to. It's just like when you see an injustice, you're going to react, but you don't have to carry it around the rest of your life or anything.
Well, it's in many ways worth remembering that Plato said the highest of the arts was politics. On the one hand, he was talking about what Madison and Jefferson were up to. But on the other hand, there's an echo in everybody's life.
Sure.
This notion of working together for common purpose or sentiment, or not being somebody this week taught me the word othering people. And there's an echo of that in this notion of politics and where it fits in life.
Yes, politics well done is ethics and virtue.
Good point.
So I don't think as being political. If I'd read certain authors, I might, but I haven't. I see it as being a question of ethics and virtue. And ethics is virtue in the collective, so it really is kind of the same thing.
All right. Any more on that?
No. I don't really like the politics we're seeing today, but it's not personal. It doesn't have to be personal for me anyway. But that's a political choice, I guess, not to be attached.
It would be seen as a political choice nowadays, even if you choose not to be attached.
True. Oh, everything's
Right.
politicized now, so yeah, I guess you can't avoid it.
All right.
Whoa.
For today.